Okay, this is chapter 18, section 2, urbanization. Urbanization essentially means the growth of cities. And so the first section is on city growth. So as we discussed in chapter 17, you know that because of industrialization, people were flocking to the cities looking for jobs in the factories. Both people already in America, like the farmers or the poor, or even immigrants were coming to America specifically to look for jobs in the cities. And so the cities just continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And in some cases, you'll also see some factories that began to employ so many workers that they created their own towns to house their workers. And an example of that was Pullman, Illinois, which we talked about in chapter 17. But there were others too. And so these factory towns sometimes were absorbed by bigger cities because the bigger city continued to grow and grow. And they just kind of got absorbed by them. Or sometimes if one of these factory towns would grow so large and then the one next to them would grow really large, they kind of overlap, and so they would just merge together and create this one really big factory town. And so as more and more people are moving to the cities and as industrialization continues to grow, the cities are going to grow with them. And because the cities were getting so large, people, and so many people were living in them and working in them, there needed to be some advances in transportation. Mark Twain has a quote here. He says, "The only trouble about this town is that it's too large. You cannot accomplish anything in the way of business. You cannot even pay a friendly call without devoting a whole day to it. The distances are too great." So what Mark Twain is saying is it takes too long to get from one end of the city to the other for just a visit or for work-related things or whatever. So there needed to be some sort of development in transportation. So just looking back at what transportation looked like up until this time, in the 1820s, the biggest form of transportation was probably the omnibus. O-M-N-I-B-U-S. An omnibus was an extended horse-drawn carriage. And that was in the 1820s. Around the 1850s, you started to see horse cars, where horses would pull these things that looked like streetcars, and they would pull them on tracks so that it would go faster. That was the 1850s. And they could carry more passengers too. And in the 1880s, we see the first electric trolley cars. Those are electric cars that ran on tracks. So once again, they're faster and they can carry more people. But all of those things, the omnibus, the horse car, and the electric trolley car, those were all on the streets. And so the streets got really crowded because it wasn't just those forms of transportation, but there were a lot of people on the streets too. People were walking throughout the city. And so there needed to be something else. And so in the 1880s, we see the first elevated railroads. There's a picture on the screen of that. So people could walk under it. Horse cars and electric streetcars could be maybe pass under them, but the railroad itself was elevated. And then in the early 1900s, the first subways were built, and so that was underground. Construction was advanced at this time. Construction of all this different transportation as well as buildings was advanced when they started to use steel to create the frame for buildings and things like that. So with steel, it allowed for the first skyscrapers to be built, since they had better support and steel wasn't as heavy as iron. So the growth of cities, here's some skyscrapers. The growth of cities was not always good news, though. Because cities grew so quickly, housing was often built quickly and, unfortunately, poorly. So you see a lot of tenement houses. We've talked about those in the past, but tenement houses are just apartments that would hold a lot of families in cramped and often unsanitary conditions, and diseases would spread quite easily in those tenement houses. The cities also had issues with overcrowding. There were sanitation issues. There was no like regular trash pickup or anything like that. There's ventilation issues. Fresh air was a problem. And there was also a lack of fresh water. City upkeep was not maintained. The streets were dirty, trash piled up. And of course, industry caused a lot of poor air quality. And then another big problem with the cities was fire. There are several examples of cities that just would burst into flames because their buildings were so close together and there wasn't a whole lot of water supply to put out fires. So all of those are issues with the big cities. Okay, so moving on to section 3, the upper and middle class. So looking at the two different classes, two different consumer classes in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you're going to see a few changes from the past. So we're going to look at the upper class first. So the wealthy, once again, began to move outside of the cities. They are the ones that had the time and the money to do that. And with the improved transportation, they could now leave the crowded cities, live almost a rural existence, and commute to the city when they needed to. But some really wealthy people stayed in the cities, and they built up the ritzy areas of town. Just as an example, like the mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York. The wealthy also began purchasing really expensive goods like clothes and homes just for the purpose of showing off their wealth. This was an idea called conspicuous consumption, where you're just buying stuff to show how much money you have. Now, the wealthy had always been showing off their wealth. That's not a new idea. But what made this time period different was the mass production of consumer goods and the technological innovations. So there's more stuff to buy. A modern day example of conspicuous consumption would be like the MTV show Cribs. I don't even know if that's still on anymore, but they go into these famous people's houses and all they're doing is showing off everything they have. Their bowling alleys in their house, their 20 cars, or whatever. That's conspicuous consumption. Okay, for middle class Americans, this was a demographic that really grew with industrialization. And that's because the number of white collar jobs was growing. White collar jobs are things like managers, salesmen, advertising executives, engineers, architects, those things. Anybody who would go to work wearing a white button-up shirt and a tie. That would be a white collar job. Many of the middle class Americans lived in subdivisions on the outskirts of the city. These were the suburbs. Now, it's not the suburbs like you think of in the 1950s. Those are going to come much, much later. But they did live in small neighborhoods on the outside of cities. But as the middle class moved out of the city, the wealthy moved even farther out. So the most wealthy people in America, except for the ones who remained in the ritzy areas of town, the most wealthy were the farthest from the city. They had the time and money to travel to work, like I said. The middle class lived right on the outside, but the poorest people lived at the core of the city. And in that class, everyone in the family worked. Some worked more than one job. Those people could not afford to move away from work, so they had to stay in the city. So back to the middle class. Something developed around this time called middle class domesticity. Pre-industrialization, before all of this stuff happened, most people worked from their homes. They were farmers, they were artisans, they were merchants, whatever it was. They didn't have a place to go to work. They worked from their homes. But things changed with industrialization, and work meant having to leave the home. And so it created a separation between home and work. And so this is where middle class domesticity comes from. It means that the home represented comfort and an escape from the outside world of industry, competition, and commerce. Now, women, as usual, were expected to work in their homes and create a refuge for their husbands and a place to nurture their children. There's a quote on the PowerPoint here that describes that. The woman who could not make a home, like the man who could not support one, was condemned. But with that said, women's rights were improving. They were getting greater property rights, greater divorce rights by the end of the 1800s. But they were still considered inferior to men, and they should be submissive to their husbands. There's a quote on the PowerPoint here from a physician. It says, "Her mind could be employed but little and in trivial matters. Her proper place was as the companion or ornamental appendage to man." Basically what this doctor is saying is that a woman could think, but only about, little minor things. She can't think about big things. And the proper place for her is to be a trophy wife, to be arm candy, an ornamental appendage to a man. So some women rebelled against this idea, and they started to refuse to get married. So since less women were marrying, so were less men. And for the first time, being a bachelor was okay. Before this, a man was expected to marry, be the head of a household, be a father, provide for that household. But now being a bachelor was okay because women were refusing to get married. So changing times led to changing ideals. Before this, being a man, like I said, was defined as getting married, being the patriarch as a family, and being your own boss. But with industrialization and society changes, marriages decreased. And most workers had a boss. They worked for someone else. They weren't their own boss. So then manhood, being manly, became less about growing up and more about masculinity. It was less about not being a child and more about not being feminine. So men started to want to prove their masculinity, since they couldn't do it by being their own boss, and a whole lot of them weren't getting married and being the patriarch of their family. Since they couldn't prove it that way, they had to prove their masculinity through sports. And they did that by playing football and boxing. Or baseball was a popular sport at the time too. Or they would work out and gain muscle to show how manly they were. And they spent a lot of time outdoors roughing it to show how manly they were. Children experience change as well. In the past, children were seen as another member of the family that could work. But for the middle class, that's not necessary anymore. Plus, there's also child labor laws that are starting to get passed that were limiting that. So the idea of adolescence emerged. Adolescence is an extended stage of life between childhood and adulthood. So it's basically like the teenage years. So children were no longer seen as another member of the family that could work. And they were now being prepared for adulthood through education rather than through just going to work. So less middle-class children were working, school enrollment went up, and children were staying in school longer. High school attendance increased, college attendance increased. So lots of things are changing because of industrialization, with the social classes, with the role of men, the role of women, and even the role of children.